As someone who'd rather go see a Broadway show than a baseball game, professional sports never really interested me, and I doubt I'm alone in feeling that way. But there's one sport in particular that a nerd like me genuinely enjoys watching. It is everything that I feel is lacking in most other mainstream sports. At first glance, cycling may not be the most exciting sport, but once you get a better understanding of what's going on, it's actually very compelling. There's a huge emphasis on teamwork and working together, even between competing riders. Almost no other sport incorporates a completely man-operated machine, and all of this is done within spitting distance of the spectators, literally. And even though the Tour de France isn't a huge event in the US, it's still one of the most popular sports around the globe. And just this past year, it attracted 600 million more viewers than the 2018 Olympics. And even if you're not interested in the actual sport, watching a cycling race can be like watching a nature special or a historical documentary. Whenever the riders go through a small town, the commentators will mention some of the history in the area. It's also just beautiful to watch as the race weaves through the breathtaking countryside. And it's also an incredibly scientific sport. Their bikes are superbly optimized machines, and quite frankly, their bodies are no different. Each rider has a strictly controlled diet, and each watt of energy they produce is heavily accounted for. This is because despite the hundreds of kilometers they travel each day, races can be won by a fraction of a second. So whether it's indoor track cycling, where riders compete in a variety of events inside a specially designed arena, or the road race, which is perhaps the most well-known, every possible variable is taken into account. And just like most other sports, it's broken up by seasons, which consist of several different grand tours, the most prestigious being the Tour de France, but there's also the Vuelta de España and the Giro d'Italia. And each tour is about 20 days long, with each day being a single stage of the race. These stages are designed to test riders who specialize in different areas. Some stages are more flat, which benefit the sprinters who typically have more powerful and larger legs. And while that's sometimes a huge advantage, it can be quite a hindrance once they get to the mountains. Unlike the climbers, whose smaller frame mean they're carrying less weight when pedaling uphill. And each of these stages are highly contested because it brings the rider and their team a lot of exposure depending on how well they place. But there are also several prizes that are awarded based on a rider's performance throughout the entire tour, not just in a single stage. These take the form of jerseys, which signify that their wearer is leading in a specific category, and they can change hands at the end of every stage depending on the results of the day. There's the polka dot jersey, which goes to the best rider in the mountains, the green jersey, which goes to the rider who's won the most sprints, and the white jersey for best young rider. And finally, there's the coveted yellow jersey, which is awarded to the rider who has the fastest overall time across every stage. And whoever finishes the last stage wearing the yellow jersey is the overall winner of the tour. And because the yellow jersey is so heavily contested, there are only about 10 or so riders who are even capable of winning it. But these general contenders don't do it alone. Every rider in a professional race is a member of a team, and they're each assigned different roles depending on their individual strengths. For example, each team has what's called a domestique, which is a rider who provides support for their stronger teammates.
A domestique is the hard worker that's most of the time behind the scenes. A lot of times our work is done in the bits that people don't watch on TV or that aren't focused on so much, but our job is to make sure that the leaders get to the most important points of the race as fresh and well prepared as possible and in the right position so that they only use their energy when they absolutely need to. The rest falls on us.
And each team goes into every stage with a strategy for how to get their lead rider into the most advantageous position. So if you're not familiar with the sport, cycling can look like a jumbled mess of riders, but there's actually an immense amount of method to the madness. For example, the large group of riders is called a peloton. Being positioned in the peloton has advantages because you're with the majority of the riders and thus conserving energy. And that's because the riders in front cut through the air, creating what's called a slipstream. This makes it much easier for the riders behind because they don't have to fight the wind.
If there's one rider in front of you, you have a draft. If there are 100 riders in front of you, you're not even pedaling.
This means that if you're in the peloton, you're expending much less energy to go just as fast. And it may be hard to tell when watching on TV, but the riders in the peloton continually rotate positions and use their collective strength. So it's not just a single rider doing all the work. This is where the intense aerodynamics and teamwork come into play. By having strong teammates who can expend a lot of energy and cut through the wind, the general contenders can conserve their energy and wait for the perfect moment to strike. And that's what makes it so difficult to break away from the peloton. It functions like a massive team, enabling them to move much faster and over longer distances than a smaller group or a single rider. This means if someone is able to break away and get ahead, they have to outrace 100 other athletes who are all using their collective strength to try and catch up. But if you want to win a stage, you have to be willing to take the risk and charge ahead. However, another challenge with this is riders are always on the lookout for opponents who are itching to go ahead of the peloton. So in order to successfully get away, the rider has to wait and make their move at just the right moment. Once a single rider or a small group of riders has gotten significantly ahead of the peloton, they're called a breakaway. They then try to maintain or strengthen their lead, but since there are fewer riders, it's very difficult for them to stay ahead. However, the larger the breakaway, the more likely they are to succeed, especially since the peloton won't always charge after a breakaway. They'll usually wait for the riders ahead to tire themselves out, since it's usually a much smaller group. But what usually happens in a smaller breakaway is that once they make it several kilometers from the finish, the more likely each rider is to attack and try and get ahead of the rest of the group. And if they're not working together, it's much easier for the peloton to catch up. And since they're not conserving energy by maintaining that aerodynamic form, they quickly get caught by the peloton. Then the riders who've been conserving energy in the larger group will end up fighting it out to win the stage. But you don't win if you never try, and that's what the breakaways are all about. They're an opportunity to show what you're capable of by staying ahead of the peloton for as long as possible. And if you're lucky, maybe try to win the stage. But unfortunately, the lure of victory is sometimes so great, the sport has perhaps become forever tainted by scandal.
It's 1999, the master of the race of truth. He brings it to an end as a winner. Armstrong wins the time trial and wins the Tour de France.
To some, the controversies of the past make the victories of the present much less satisfying, which is a huge shame. But the reason why modern cycling continues to be associated with cheating is because of just how widespread doping was during the late 90s and early 2000s. And while most people point to Lance Armstrong as the exemplar cheater, and he certainly was, many other riders were just as guilty. It may go without saying, but one of the reasons that doping became so prevalent is because the athletes are all performing at their absolute limits, so just a tiny boost of something extra can make all the difference. And when one rider is performing at an inhuman level, it becomes nearly impossible to compete. But despite the fact that everyone was doing it, Armstrong has undeniably become the face of the scandal. And for many reasons, he only has himself to blame. Armstrong not only cheated, but he adamantly refuted all claims that he was doping.
I've said it for 7 years. I've said it for longer than 7 years. I have never doped.
Did you ever take banned substances to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Not only was Armstrong himself doping, but he also set up a shockingly elaborate system to deliver the drugs to his teammates. This drug ring involved a motorcyclist who would follow the tour and would sneak drugs to his team hidden in Coke bottles.
The sophistication came not just from something like Motoman, but the idea of how Motoman fit into this grander plan. That like, okay, here's what we need, and here's who's going to provide it, and then here's how it's going to get to us in a way that's undetectable.
And if that wasn't bad enough, Lance and several of his teammates would also receive blood transfusions in their hotel rooms the night before a race. But it's important to note that nobody started doping using such extreme measures. Several of Armstrong's teammates have said that it was a slow and gradual process until they were already in so deep that they couldn't see a way out. And that's precisely why it became so prevalent, because riders were pressured to do it. The same way anyone is peer pressured, cyclists were told by even their team doctor that everyone is doing it. But it's perhaps because of that fact that the widespread cheating was exposed. One of Armstrong's teammates, Tyler Hamilton, was one of the first riders to come forward and work with investigators.
My whole career, when I was doping, I always thought this is way too big of a secret for it not to come out. Because, when I first started in 1997 doping, the majority of the peloton was doping. And I always thought this one day will come out. And yeah, I guess I was sort of part of that process of doping coming out, the whole truth coming out.
And because riders like Hamilton and later Lance Armstrong broke the silence, it's become much less of a taboo to talk about doping. Part of why it was so widespread was because nobody on the inside was willing to admit that it was a problem. This makes riders today much less likely to stay quiet if they see someone cheating, or are pressured to do something that they don't agree with. They now know that they'll have the support of the fans and the cycling community by exposing those who cheat, or at the very least, not participate.
We're all doing our level best out here to try and race this as hard as we can, to try and change the image of the sport.
But on top of the social deterrent, the drug testing has also become much more prevalent and more scientifically stringent. There are third-party testers who accompany the victor and runner-ups of every race until they provide a urine sample. And on top of the independent investigators, most every team has their own testing regimen, and if they don't feel confident in a rider's results, they've been known to voluntarily pull the offender from their roster in upcoming races. And even if you don't trust the measures that are currently taken to prevent doping, cycling is still a beautiful sport to watch. The Tour goes through some of the most breathtaking European towns, cities, and landscapes. And while the riders struggle to sprint up some of the tallest peaks in the Alps and the Pyrenees, you get to watch as the landscape slowly opens up below. And it's not like they stay in one location. Each stage is designed to present a new challenge, so the riders end up going through a wide variety of locations. And sometimes they'll go through several towns or villages in a single stage, all of which have incredible history and breathtaking architecture. And the announcers will often pause from narrating the race and talk about the history of notable landmarks as the riders speed past.
This is the Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye that we can see here. The first ever chateau was built here back in 1124 by King Louis VI, and his little nickname was King Louis the Fat. I just think that's rather wonderful.
And just like most other sports, cycling also has a host of engaging athletes.
How was it for you to go out and then you get all those serious questions asked and you're like, yeah, I'm taking it easy. Wow. That's awesome. Why? Why so serious?
One sprinter in particular, Peter Sagan, is incredibly fun to watch. Not only is he one of the best sprinters currently competing, but he always puts on a show. It isn't out of the ordinary to see him cross the finish line doing a wheelie. So even if the competition for the main winner of the race, the yellow jersey, isn't that intense, there's almost always an exciting sprint or a jaw-dropping performance at the end of every stage, especially since it's an opportunity for some of the lesser-known riders to get exposure for themselves and their team. And as I mentioned, cycling is an incredibly mathematical sport. The energy output of each rider is carefully measured and mapped out for each climb, and the aerodynamics of the bike and the rider's position can help shave off precious seconds. Although this technical side may turn some audiences away, to me these are some of the most interesting aspects of the sport. Each team tries to calculate exactly what needs to be done for the coming race, and how those calculations and plans are executed when they inevitably encounter things they can't control is where all the excitement comes from. But the sport itself also has a wonderful balance between personal glory and intense teamwork.
It's a roller coaster of emotions the whole tour. So when you're going into Paris and you've got the yellow jersey in your team, you've won it, you definitely feel like you're part of that win, 100%.
And it can't be stressed enough how important teamwork is to the sport of cycling. If you want to have any chance of winning a stage or any of the jerseys, you need an incredibly strong team supporting you. And beyond the individual teams, each rider has to work with their competitors at some point, whether it's in a breakaway or in the peloton. If a rider isn't willing to rotate positions and share the aerodynamic burden, then they'll simply be left behind. So even though cycling may sometimes be the butt of the joke,
our roided up guy beat your roided up guy.
there's a lot to it that many people might not know. And as I said, it's incredibly unique and incorporates a lot of very nerdy things that you don't find in most other sports. And for me, once I understood it better, I found that it's incredibly entertaining, and I think more people should give it a shot.
Vive le Tour!